Okay, I'll check that you guys can hear all right. How's the sound this side? It's okay? Or it's okay? You guys at the back, you okay for sound up there? I think that's a nod. You guys okay? You guys in the middle? Good. Okay, well, we'll just wait until it clicks itself over that one more minute. Oh, I think it's gone, hasn't it? Anyway, okay, so today we're going to start the final of the 5 markets that we look at in this course, and this is the foreign exchange market. So this is the last of the 5, and then after this we'll start on the institutions. So this topic should take 3 lectures. We should have today, tomorrow, and Friday. We should finish it on Friday. So the topic is the foreign exchange markets, and so this is an outline of where we're going. We're going to talk about some background and the need for the international markets. Primarily, the international markets are the foreign exchange markets. Then we'll talk about markets themselves, exchange rates, how they're quoted, how they're set in terms of an equilibrium in trading. And we'll talk about some of the fundamental drivers of the exchange rate. The balance of payments is a key one. International trade, how that is involved with exchange rates, some theories around them, some other influences, and then some specialist topics on like financing international trade. This sort of falls under this topic, but it's also, we've met it before, particularly in the money market section, some of the special instruments that are used to finance international trade. And again, we'll touch on the euro currency markets, which we've touched on before, both in the money market and in the bond market section. So when you read this textbook isn't really that much different to any others. They motivate the need for the foreign exchange markets in terms of trade. So basically, the basic idea is that if you buy something from a supplier in a foreign country, then you don't pay them with your domestic currency. You somehow have to change your domestic currency and turn it into the foreign currency of whatever that supplier is. Let's say you're buying from Japan. So you've got to take your New Zealand dollars, turn them into Japanese yen somehow to make that payment. Now, all textbooks basically start from that point of view, and they just casually mention somewhere along the way that in actual fact there's lots more trading in the market than can be explained by trade. And so I picked up some figures this morning, hot off the press. So this is the foreign exchange market in terms of the trading per day relative to some of the other markets we've studied. That was the New York Stock Exchange. We can skip that one. But equities market, all equity markets throughout the entire world, there's about $191 billion traded through the equity markets on a daily basis. Go to the derivatives, the futures market is one of the largest ones. $437.4 billion traded in that market across the entire world, all futures markets on a daily basis. But when you go to the foreign exchange market, we're getting about $5.3 trillion traded in the market on a daily basis. Now, these numbers down the bottom, I just picked up this morning from the World Trade Organization website to sort of give for comparison. So they say, and these were the last year for which they had complete data, which is 2015. Don't know quite why 2016 got to, but it's about 16 trillion per year in merchandise, basically the trade in goods, and another 12.5 trillion in trades in services. So when you look at the foreign exchange market in round figures, the foreign exchange market is about 50 times larger than is necessary to support the trade in goods and services. So you thought, what are they doing? And the basic answer is, well, it's like some of these other markets. They had a purpose. They had a particular purpose, like you think of derivatives. They had a purpose of managing risk. But then they became a way for people to create and trade risk for the purpose of profiting from that trade. And that's essentially what's happened with the foreign exchange. We can motivate why we should have it in terms of trade in goods and services, the need to make payments across countries. But most trading in the foreign exchange market is people trading foreign exchange for the purposes of profiting from trading foreign exchange. It has no other purpose than that. And, as you can see there from those numbers, do the math, approximately 50 times larger than is necessary to support the trade of goods and services. So that's something to bear in mind as we go along. The other thing I picked up this morning was what kind of currencies get traded. There's a little pie graph of them. Now, it does take a tiny bit of explanation, like these are in percent. So this is the US dollar, 84.9%. The blue one, that's the euro at 39.1%. You think, that's more than 100. So the reason these things don't add to 100, they actually add to 200, is because every time you trade a currency, you have to have two currencies in there. And so what it's saying in this is that 84.9%, nearly 85% of all trades in the foreign exchange market, one of those currencies is US dollar. And so some of these ones over here, when you look at the euro at 39.1%, some of the trades of the euro will be with US dollar, and some will be with others. So if you add up all these numbers, they come to 200%. So the big one, not surprising, is the US dollar. And then they go down, there's the euro, Japanese yen at 19%, then pounds. Kind of surprisingly, the Australian dollar here is at 7.6%. New Zealand's not listed there, but in terms of that, it's about 2.1%. So significant trade in the New Zealand dollar on a daily basis. So that's something to bear in mind, because it does get mentioned, and I'll have some other figures as we go through about the trading that goes on in the market, but that's not how we motivate why these things exist. So when we're thinking about why they exist, if you think about international trades, primarily in goods, international trade has been going on for many thousands of years. There's been long trade routes both over water and over land. For example, for hundreds of years, there was a trade route called the Silk Road that went from China in the east, and when you came to the west, on the northern side, it went as far as Ireland. On the southern side, it went as far as present-day Sudan. And people traded along that route over land. There were also very long trade routes, even thousands of years ago, over water. For example, if you went back to ancient Egypt, they had papyrus boats, and they would leave Egypt and they would sail as far as the tip of India in one direction to trade, and in the other direction they went all the way down to the tip of Africa to trade. Now, they actually went even further than that for purposes of exploration. In fact, the Egyptians actually circumnavigated Africa in reed boats for exploration purposes rather than trade. But what makes that type of trade different to the type of trade that we have today is there's basically two things. One is usually the trader actually went and physically inspected whatever goods he's going to buy. And so what he would do was he'd load up his camels or his boat or whatever it was with valuable goods from his home country, would go off to trade, and he would inspect the goods he was going to trade, and then he would barter, and they'd make the trade, and he'd bring those goods back to his home country and sell them hopefully at a profit. Now, in many cases today, in international trades, the buyer simply does not go and inspect the goods. So if you want to buy stainless steel from Japan, there's some international standard that applies, and you say, oh, that's a 304 food-grade stainless steel. I know what that is. I can buy that, and they don't have to go and actually look at it. So that's changed. And the other thing that's changed is there's no intrinsic value in the currencies that we are now using to trade with. If you went back to ancient times, they would take valuable goods from the home country. Sometimes they would take valuable metals like gold and silver, and they would trade with that because it had value. Now, today, not only, if you look at the paper money, pretty worthless sort of stuff, it's only worth something because there's a convention backed by the law of government that says that it's worth something. Most of the money in the world is simply in an electronic database, and you simply move numbers around electronically, and the value changes. And so there is this essentially a way that to trade in terms of the dollars and cents, or the yens, or whatever it is, that we did not have in the past. So if you're thinking about buying something, and for example, if you're thinking about buying a textbook for one of the classes that you're having, there's often multiple suppliers on offer now. It used to be in the old days, you could get it from the university bookshop. If it wasn't there, you were sunk. But now you can buy it from the university bookshop. They have it in stock. If it's not there, you can get it from Amazon. Typically, you can also get it directly from the publisher. Often there's other online retailers, both here and overseas, and you simply can go out and find a good price. And it doesn't matter whether it's expressed in New Zealand dollars or something else. You can then go ahead and buy it. Now, usually, say if you go to a retailer's website overseas, typically their currency is expressed in the local currencies. For example, if you went to the Wiley website, they have their currency in Australian dollars because that's where they are. But even that is changing. Many online retailers now, if you go to see what the price is, they'll figure out where you're from, because they'll figure out what your IP address is, and they'll figure out where you're from, and they'll do a quick lookup in the market, and they'll give you a price in your local currency. So even if you go to Amazon to buy a textbook or another book of some sort, they can often quote you the price in New Zealand dollar simply by looking up the current exchange rate. But if you go ahead and do buy, then there is a foreign exchange transaction that takes place behind that, so that the retailer in whatever country they're in gets domestic currency, and you pay in your domestic currency. Now, one of the other major problems we face is this problem of information asymmetry between suppliers and customers. Often, particularly when you start looking at small businesses, there's a problem of knowing whether the other person, the counterparty, is reliable. And to give you an example of this, where I struck this, I wanted a particular book that was out of print, you see, so I had to get it on the secondhand market. And one of the things that Amazon does is that it basically operates as a front for many secondhand dealers. And I found this particular book, and I kid you not, this was the name of the place that was selling it. The name of the bookshop that was selling it was called Wild Middle-Aged Women. And that was the name of the bookshop. Okay, I know. That's what I thought. Can I trust this place? Can I trust this place? I know nothing about this place. But now, and one of the things that the financial system does for us is when we strike that problem, we want somebody else to put some trust into the trade. And basically, Amazon was handling the trade, and because I, like most people have an account at Amazon, I thought, well, if anything goes wrong, Amazon will save my bacon. And so, although I knew next to nothing about this bookshop, well, maybe nothing at all, apart from this strange name, I placed my order, and a couple of weeks later, my book arrived in the post. And so, this sort of problem that we face about information asymmetry between suppliers and buyers and sellers and all that sort of stuff, we want our financial system to take care of that problem. And certainly, when we look at what the commercial banks do, a lot of their work is substituting their creditworthiness for the creditworthiness of either their client or somebody else's client. Now, some other differences between the past and the present, and one has to do around the legal and business systems that we have in any country. If you trade cross countries, say between here and Japan, no one country has full jurisdiction over that trade. So if you run into legal problems, you can be stuck for a very long time in these things. In fact, I knew a guy who bought some trucks from Japan. There was a problem, and they were actually stuck in a warehouse while the legal issues were resolved, but it took 14 years. Yeah, long time. So that itself is a problem, and some parts are financial system that's not very well resolved. How are we going to fix these problems? But even where you think, okay, I'll deal with this, I'll get the lawyers onto it, often you'll find that the legal systems are very different. In New Zealand, Australia, Canada, Great Britain, we have what's called British common law. And because we work in that system, we tend to understand how it works. But many other systems of law exist in the world. For example, in Europe, most of Europe uses what's called French civil law, which is actually structured quite differently. Asian ones, again, different. And sometimes, basic things that you take for granted if you live in one system, like, for example, in New Zealand, copyright and patents, we just accept that they're just a normal part of life. If you want a patent, you have an invention, you can apply for one, it'll be granted, and you get some protection. There are legal systems where those sorts of things simply don't exist. And so, if you're going to trade over there, there's a possibility someone will simply steal your invention, or if it's copyright on some sort of document, book or something, they can simply steal it, and there's simply no legal comeback on them for that. Now, even with all that sort of stuff, which is really sort of a little bit outside the scope of this course, the thing that we're mostly concerned with is the exchange rate risk that people face when they trade. Because you think what happens in a trade, typically, if it's not a service, if it's a good, you have to place your order has to be filled, has to be shipped and arrived. And so there's a difference in time between when the order ships out and when you receive it. And of course, the person who is shipping it wants to be paid early. The person who is receiving it wants to be paid, pay late, when they arrive. And so what can happen in the types of market we have now is that the exchange rate will move and make those costs either more or less, as the case may be, can work against you, can work for you, and similarly for the seller, can bring you higher prices or lower prices as the exchange rate moves. So coming to the markets themselves, there has been a lot of change over the years in the way the markets themselves actually work. If we go back far enough to the gold standard, when pretty much every currency was on the gold standard, it was pretty simple to work out what a fair exchange rate was. You simply looked up what their internal rate was for exchanging their paper currency into gold, and then you looked up the one for the foreign currency that you want to trade in, and you can work out very quickly what the exchange rate should be. For example, US dollars for a long time was 35 US dollars per ounce. And let's say, for example, if you're going to change that into pounds, and pounds, let's say it was 17.5 pounds per ounce, then you can work out, it takes $2 US to buy one British pound. And when everything was on the gold standard, very simple to figure out what the exchange rate should be. Now, after World War II, there was this system set up called the Bretton Woods system. It was in operation for about 25 years, a little bit more than 25 years. And basically, every currency that was traded relative to the US dollar. And again, it's very simple in that system to work out what an exchange rate should be. So if you want to know what's the exchange rate should it be between Australia and New Zealand, you looked up our exchange rate with the US, you looked up the Australian one with the US, did a simple calculation, and you got a fair exchange rate. And the governments, in the cases that they didn't engage in anything else, they had to engage in trading within the market to make sure it stayed in this narrow range. Now, in New Zealand, at that time, what we did something quite different, is we simply rationed the amount of money that people could have. So if you wanted some foreign exchange for some reason, you had to apply for it, and sometimes they said, no, you can't have it. And if they said no, then there's simply no way for you to get it. And if you did get it, you're basically lucky. But anyway, that system ran out. It fell apart beginning in 1971. And after that point, one by one, pretty much most of the major currencies switched over to what we call a floating exchange rate system. And New Zealand changed over in 1984. And so what we allow our currency to do is to rise and fall in response to changes in the market. And so that's the way that most currencies run today. So that's really by introduction and background. So let's move on into the rates and the quotations. So first question. At its heart, what is an exchange rate? Yeah, it's simply a price. In this case, the price of one currency in terms of another. Okay, now there are two ways, if you go out into the markets, there are two ways that you can see a quotation in the foreign exchange market. One's called an indirect one, which is one we tend to use in this part of the world, and the other is called a direct exchange rate quote. So let's deal with the common one that we see. When we talk about an indirect exchange rate quote, what do we mean? local currencies in the front, and what's the consequences of that?
It's the price in terms of foreign currency.
Okay. So, okay, right. Okay, so if you think of our exchange rate at the moment is around 70 US cents. That's what the quote's about now. It's about 69 something. What that tells you is that it tells you how much 1 New Zealand dollar will buy in terms of the foreign one. So if you're looking at New Zealand dollar versus US, what it tells you is 1 New Zealand dollar will buy 70 cents US. And that's the indirect quote. And one of the things that's good about that is you think, well, because if that number gets bigger, is our currency getting more valuable or less valuable? Say it's at 69 now and went up to 72. Is our currency becoming more valuable or less valuable? More. And in the indirect quote, that's what happens. If the number gets bigger in an indirect quote, then the domestic currency becomes more valuable. Now, what about the direct one? How do we quote a direct exchange rate? Can you explain a little bit more than just opposite?
It's the foreign currency, the price of foreign currency in terms of the local currency.
Okay. Okay. So, for example, instead of saying how much, like take New Zealand dollar versus American dollars, instead of saying how many American dollars will 1 New Zealand dollar buy, in this case, about 70 cents, you're asking the question, how much domestic currency will $1 US buy? And it might be, in that case, about $1.30 something. Okay? So in this situation, in the direct one, and a lot of the world uses direct quotation, if the numbers get bigger, okay, numbers get bigger, is your domestic currency becoming more or less valuable? Numbers go up, say it was $1.30 and went to $1.40. Is the domestic currency becoming more valuable or less valuable if in a direct quote? Less valuable. Yeah, and so that's the thing that makes, well, one of the things that makes the direct quote a little bit harder to understand is as the number gets bigger, we would expect our domestic currency to become more valuable. That is true in an indirect quote, but in a direct quote, the bigger the number is, the less valuable your local currency is. So what do we mean when we say a currency appreciates or depreciates in value relative to another currency? Yeah, go ahead.
Basically, something that's supply and demand for that currency between buyers and sellers. If more people want that currency, then they're willing to pay a high price for it, so the price will appreciate or increase in value, or depreciate, so it will decrease or lower itself in value, and that is relative to the currency that you're wanting to buy.
Yeah. Okay. So the main point there is that the exchange rate is set by trading in these markets. So there's a supply and demand. And basically, if, say, for example, the demand goes up, that's going to push the price up. Now, that means, another way of looking at that, is that the value of the domestic currency appreciates. So if the demand for that domestic currency appreciates, goes up, then the value of it appreciates. And conversely, if it goes the other way, either demand drops off or supply increases, then the value of that currency goes down, and we say in that case that the currency depreciates relative to, and it always has to be relative to some other currency. It doesn't just depreciate in a vacuum, and that's why when we looked at that pie chart thing, that's why they had it summing to 200%, is because there's always two currencies in any particular quotation. So there's always two. So let's see if we missed anything. Said all that, I think. There are a few countries left that don't let their currencies float. So there's some examples. I think we said most of that. Yep. So there's a direct quote. In this case, the euro against New Zealand dollar. one way of interpreting is that is either the euro will buy 1.717 New Zealand dollars, or conversely, it takes 1.717 New Zealand dollars to buy a euro. And in that situation, if that number gets bigger, our currency is getting less valuable. And this is the one that we use here, the indirect. And the good thing about that is if that number goes up, then it means that our currency is getting more valuable. And it's certainly much easier to understand an indirect quote. Now, most of the rest of the world uses a direct quote. In Europe and in the British Commonwealth countries, including ourselves, we use the indirect quotes. So if you go out to work in the big wide world, you may work in a country where the other convention is used. Now, in the derivatives section, we talked about the forward rates. And typically, if you go to a dealer like a bank and look at their rates, typically you'll find what's called a spot rate, and that's basically what they will trade with you now. But also, because there are dealers in the forward market, there's rates there. So if you want to hedge for whatever reason, they actually have a bunch of quotes there, and you can pretty much figure out what you're going to get if you go and actually talk to them about getting a hedge. Now these are getting pretty old now. I should replace these. Now, when you look at them, there's two basic columns. There's the bank buys and there's the bank sells. And then within that, there's three different columns here. There's this one here. This is the electronic transaction. So if you're going to trade foreign exchange electronically, this is the price that they're quoting for you. If the bank, say, the bank buys an Australian dollar off you, that was 0.8237, I think 7 it was. If you walked in with an actual Australian dollar check, then this is the rate that would apply. And if you walked in with Australian notes and coins, that rate would apply there. And the difference between them is simply the cost of doing business. The cheapest way of doing business in this market for the bank is electronically, and so you get the best price there. You bring in a paper check, there's more cost associated with that, so you don't get as good a price. And then most costly is, and if you bring in notes and coins, and so out of the three, you get the worst price. And again, on the other side, when the bank sells, you have three different quotes, depending on what type of transaction you make. Now, the other thing to notice about this is that, like, if you look here, there's some currencies where there's no quotations. Now, for example, Philippine peso is one where there's some no quotations for either the checks or the foreign currency. It doesn't mean that you can't trade the peso, Philippine peso, with the bank. It's basically, if you want to do that, you have to have a custom transaction done for you. They don't provide this as a normal part of the service simply because the volume is not there. But if you walked in one day and said, actually I need to buy some pesos, please, they will probably do a custom transaction. Of course, probably cost you a lot, but they don't give you a quotation there for that. So both on the buy side and on the sell side, there's a group here where there's no quotations. And often what happens in reality when you need to do this is they often go through a third currency. For example, if you want to buy Philippine pesos, typically what you'll find is the Philippine peso has a greater liquidity with a third currency, say for US dollars. And so how they would structure the transaction to actually get you that money is that they would trade initially New Zealand dollars to US dollars, and then they would trade US dollars for pesos, and then they'd sell them to you for whatever that cost, plus their markup, of course. So most banks that are big banks in particular, you can go through the websites and you can see the exchange rates pretty much updated on a daily basis, sometimes even more than that, and see whatever the exchange rate is. So as the New Zealand dollar fluctuates against these currencies, they update, and then if you need to trade, you can see pretty much what it's going to cost you. Yeah, there's the point we made about something like more like the Philippine peso, typically what they'll do is they'll do an intermediate trade. New Zealand dollar, US dollar to peso, and then they'll get you your money. So again, you can work out, for example, if this was a New Zealand dollar versus US, and that's US versus the Australian, then you can work out what the exchange rate between the New Zealand and Australian dollars are from those two things. And for currencies that aren't very liquid, that's typically how they do it. Okay, any questions to this point? Okay, everybody's happy? So, like most markets these days, set by supply and demand. So what do we mean when we talk about an equilibrium exchange rate? What do we mean? Do you have any idea? No. You're in a finance class. Yeah, go ahead.
Basically, in terms of where the supply for a certain currency meets the demand for a certain currency, and therefore that is the cost at which people will trade.
Yeah. So if we draw a picture of that, it's just like any other price that is set by supply and demand. And so if we have up here on this side here, this is our this is our exchange rate. There's yeah, this okay. And this is the quantity along here, and we'll make this an indirect rather than a direct, simply because it makes the drawing the diagram a little bit easier to understand. If the price comes down, like any other price, the demand tends to go up. So if there's some demand there, depending on what the price is, the demand will simply follow this line. If the price comes down, demand simply changes. Have I got that right? Have I got this right? Actually, I got this. No, I think it's the other way around. Sorry. Anyway, make it direct. So, in the other direction, there'll be some supply, and basically, at some point, here, whatever this is, there is a particular exchange rate, at time zero, that will actually balance the supply and demand. And so, in any market set price, in this case, the price being set is the exchange rate. As long as we let the market do what it wants to do and set it, pretty much any exchange rate that we look at is an equilibrium rate. So if the exchange rate was 0.69 against the US this morning, and by midday it was 0.695, all the way along between the 0.690 and the 695, all those exchange rates along that entire path are exchange rates that are equilibrium rates because they're set by supply and demand. So if, for example, something happened and say the demand went up, put the demand out over here, and so there's demand at time one. No, it wasn't direct. It was indirect. Sorry. So the demand goes up, and then there's our exchange rate at time one. So demand for the currency goes up, and for example, why it might go up is that more people are buying New Zealand goods, so we're exporting more. There's demand for New Zealand currency rises, and that drives up the exchange rate. So as long as we let the market do what it wants to do, any exchange rate that we look up now is an equilibrium exchange rate. Now, in the old days, when say in New Zealand foreign currency was rationed, we could have an exchange rate that was way far away from equilibrium. It's simply that because the currency was rationed, there may be a demand there that simply was never satisfied because the Reserve Bank would not hand out the foreign currency to do it. But if we let it do it like this, then pretty much any exchange rate we look at now is an equilibrium rate. Okay, any questions on that before we move on? Yeah, go ahead.
Just wondering how you observe this equilibrium exchange rate in mind. How you get it? I mean, apparently that you need to know the supply of a total, like for example, if this example is New Zealand dollars against Australian dollars, so you need the total currency of New Zealand dollars and total currency of Australian dollars to work out this equilibrium exchange rate.
Well, in one sense, in a theoretical sense, if you want to work out theoretically what the exchange rate should be, yeah, you would need to know all that sort of stuff. But in reality, if you look at something like this, exchange rates in quotations here, I mean, they've got their bid-ask spread around this, okay, but they're somewhere in the middle. If you take the two, the two electronic ones, they put a bid-ask spread around that, so they make a profit. But basically, in the middle between those two things is the equilibrium rate. In one sense, we don't really need to know all the mechanics of who is demanding, how much they're demanding, who is supplying, how much they're supplying, how much would they change if the exchange rate changed. All this just ends up at a single rate in the market. And so if we went out to the market today and let's say this morning, the exchange rate against the Australian dollars was 0.92, 9200, then what essentially we're saying is that this mechanism is the mechanism that works to set that rate. And although you might say, well, what would happen, in terms of the volume, if the exchange rate was different? If you wanted, in a theoretical sense, you might want to know that so you can actually calculate it. But you don't have to know that. You don't have to know how people would respond to a change in the exchange rate, because the market actually simply sorts it all out. I mean, there's thousands of traders out there doing all sorts of things. Some of them are those, just currency traders. Some are buyers and sellers of goods and services. And the whole lot working together sets this rate. And you don't have to know the details of who's trading, the volumes, how they would trade differently, if the exchange rate differently. You don't have to know all that, because the market simply takes care of it. Does that answer your question? It does. Good. Any other questions? Yep, go ahead.
You changed it back to indirect.
Yeah, I did.
But isn't it like, if we use just like the theoretical example of New Zealand and Australian dollars, and so the demand for Australian dollars increases, and so the price, so the amount that we have to pay in New Zealand dollars increases per each Australian dollar, wouldn't that be direct?
Oh,
Because
okay.
otherwise you would have like inverted movements on the graph.
Yeah. Okay, so that's why that pie chart that's got this 200%. So for every currency transaction, there's another one on the other side. And so what we're looking at in terms of this one is what's happening to, if the New Zealand demand for New Zealand dollars went up, demand for New Zealand dollars went up. Now, of course, there has to be some other foreign currency that is being traded. And so if it was against the Australian dollar, okay, and the demand for the New Zealand currency rose relative to the Australian currency, then our currency would appreciate in value relative to the Australian currency.
Oh, okay, so you would like from the point of the commodity being bought and sold as the New Zealand currency.
Yeah. If we put the quote up in terms of the other way around and said, well, it's the Australian dollar is the base one, and that's what we're interested in. And the exchange, if there was demand for that, then it would appreciate relative to the New Zealand dollars. So in all cases, there's always two currencies. In this case, what we're saying, well, what would happen to the value of the New Zealand dollar relative to the trading partner? If it was U.S. dollars, if the demand for New Zealand dollars went up relative to U.S. dollars, then the exchange rate would move up. And if you looked at it from the other way, then you get the exact opposite. If you looked at it from a U.S. dollar point of view, you get the exact opposite. Okay. Okay. Did that answer your question?
I was just confused about what.
I know, I get confused too. You're loud. Yeah. I get confused too, unfortunately. Always got to stop and think about these things. Sometimes it takes a while to figure out which one. Yeah.
So you're looking at, like with this graph, you're looking at more from the point of view of really trying to sell New Zealand dollars if you're looking at how much New Zealand dollars worth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, any other questions? Right, so moving along. Now, one of the things that and we'll come to this a bit more, if you're thinking about like fundamental drivers of the exchange rate, just a long set of words here. Let's say, for example, British goods are cheaper than New Zealand, so we tend to then import. Now, what will happen, if that's true, is that New Zealand imports more and demand for pounds goes up and supply of dollars into the market also increases. So we're putting more New Zealand dollars in there, that supply goes up, demand for the pound goes up. And that drives up the price of pounds relative to the New Zealand dollar. And the opposite way thing works there. So one of the things to take out of this is that if you think about the problem of trade and what we would like in our world is we would like trade in goods and services between countries to be balanced, basically so that countries are not in surplus, they're not in deficit, they're nicely balanced. And one of our main mechanisms for trying to have that happen is the foreign exchange rate. And so if you're looking at, British goods are cheaper, so we buy them. Now, the very consequence of the fact that we're buying more British goods drives their exchange rate up relative to ours. That puts the price up of those goods and makes them less attractive. So what we're hoping for in terms of our exchange rate, in terms of trade, is that it always moves, we hope it will always move in such a way that it brings trade back into balance. So if there's a trade imbalance with Great Britain, they're selling us more than we're selling them, we hope the exchange rate will move to bring that back into balance. If it's the other way around, we are selling more than they are selling to us, then the exchange rate, we hope, will move in such a way as to bring that trade back into balance. Now, when you look at the volume of trading that goes on in the market, like 50 times necessary for trade in goods and services, this mechanism, which is one of them, not quite the only one, but is like the main mechanism that we have to try to get trade back into balance, it doesn't work very well because of all these other factors in terms of all this other trading that goes on in the market. But this is the basic thing that we want to happen. We want trade to be balanced. We don't want to be imbalances. But our exchange rate system that we have today doesn't actually give that to us. So that's the same diagram I just drew. So there's a thing. So here again, it's a bit of a summary. If there's a demand shift, increase in foreign demand for a country's goods and services, there's this increase in demand for the currency to pay for it, and that tends to drive, the currency in the way that is necessary to bring trade back into balance. So here's your problem. Exports bigger than imports, demand for domestic currency is greater than supply of currency, and appreciates it. So it appreciates. That tends to make the exports less attractive and the imports more attractive, and hopefully, over time, trade will come back into balance. That's the basic idea, that we want the system to work. We want this to happen. Unfortunately, it doesn't, and we'll come to some of the reasons why it doesn't. Any questions on this? Because this is a sort of fairly fundamental part of our trading system that we have in the world. Yeah?
I was going to say, so with the increase and decrease in countries' currencies, depending on trade, is that also largely affected by how sensitive overseas suppliers are towards those demand, that supply and demand as well? Because were talking about if UK goods were cheaper than New Zealand goods, and so people buying the UK goods and then pushing price of pounds up. Because then wouldn't the overseas suppliers be able to offset that by just making the UK goods more expensive, and so it'd be more expensive for their domestic customers and for their foreign customers as well?
Well, if they change their internal pricing, like if say, I mean, typically a British producer of something will be selling on the domestic market and also selling overseas, if they change their prices domestically, okay, that would also probably change the foreign price as well. Okay, but what can happen because the currency moves is even without changing the domestic price at all, the profitability of the trades overseas can rise and fall, and this is where your foreign exchange risk comes from. Now, if they're smart, they can probably actually run two prices, a local price and a foreign price. And plenty places do that. They do. They have a foreign price and a domestic price in response to what's happening in these markets. Did I answer your question? I did. Okay. Any other questions? You got a question? Yeah? Go ahead.
Just wondering, is there any regulator for this international currency exchange market?
Most of these are if they're trading domestically within their country, then there are regulators. If you're trading across internationally, there's often not an international regulator that deals with it, but there's often codes of practices put in place, voluntary codes of practice, which are actually widely adhered to because, as long as they adhere to them, then it makes the trading go much smoother. Just like, for example, yesterday we talked about the swap dealers. And there's a Swap Dealers Association. They have a code of practice that applies internationally, and most dealers abide by that code of practice. And so when you're dealing with, say, if you're actually going to trade with a foreign bank, there's no one regulator that deals with it, but often there are codes of practice which banks adhere to because they want their business to continue.
Yes, from what you say that, because from the previous example you said that if the export is increased, so you're going to drive back to the currency, for the currency rate, so hopefully you're going to just kind of like drive back to the other side from the content. So I've noticed that right now we actually doing assignment for 207 about free trade.
Yeah.
Then Trump actually accused China as a currency manipulator.
Yeah.
And
I've noticed
I've noticed that actually. So just my question is, so is there any like regulation to
No.
like the whole thing?
There are some international organizations like the World Trade Organization that you can go to and complain to, but often the compliance with those is voluntary. Like if Trump wants to say China's a currency manipulator, he might go and whine to the World Trade Organization, but compliance by the Chinese is voluntary. And most people, they comply because this is their business and they don't want their business to dry up. If you don't comply with a voluntary code of practice, then people will go elsewhere. But it is voluntary, and if you don't want to comply, no one can make you in many of the international trade situations. Okay, let's move on. We've got a couple of minutes left here. Okay, so I'll stop at this point, and we'll pick this up at this point tomorrow. So if you want to ask any questions, be around for a while. Otherwise, we'll start here tomorrow.